The countdown clock on the wall read 24 hours. Inside the command center, the panic was suffocating. Professor Sterling, the world's leading astrophysicist, stared at the whiteboard, defeated. The thermal equation for the billion-dollar rocket was failing, and his team of elite PhDs stood in silence, helpless. Suddenly, a quiet voice broke the tension. Elias, an elderly janitor holding a mop, pointed a trembling finger at the board. "Excuse me, sir," Elias whispered. "The variable on line 3 is wrong." Sterling spun around, face red with rage, and threw his chalk at the old man. "Get out! Don't let your ignorance dirty my board!" He didn't know he had just silenced the only man who could save them. The white chalk dust settled on Elias's navy blue work shirt, leaving a mark that looked like a scar. The room was frozen. It was not the silence of contemplation. It was the silence of absolute shock. To the 20 PhDs in the room, the janitor had not just spoken out of turn. The furniture had started talking. Professor Sterling did not just look angry, he looked violated. He adjusted his glasses, stepping over the piece of chalk he had thrown, and marched until he was inches from Elias's face. The smell of expensive cologne clashed with the scent of ammonia and floor wax clinging to the old man. Sterling spoke with a voice that was dangerously calm. He asked Elias if he knew what a differential equation was. He asked if Elias knew that the people in this room had spent more years in university than Elias had likely spent alive. He called Elias a distraction. He called him a nuisance. He did not call him a man. Elias gripped the handle of his mop tighter, his knuckles turning ash gray. He could see the numbers on the board dancing in his mind. He saw the error as clearly as a stain on a white tile. It wasn't a math error, it was a logic error. They were treating the heat shield as a solid barrier, not a fluid dynamic system. Elias tried one more time. He kept his eyes lowered, a habit learned from decades of being invisible. He whispered that it was like a pressure cooker. If you seal the lid too tight without a vent, the steam doesn't disappear. It explodes. He pointed to the third line again, explaining that the variable needed to breathe. The room erupted in laughter. It was a cruel, sharp sound. One of the junior scientists mocked him, asking if he learned physics from reading the back of a bleach bottle. Sterling raised his hand, silencing the laughter. He was done being amused. He pressed the intercom button on the wall and summoned security. He told them there was a security breach in the command center. 2 large guards arrived within seconds. They didn't ask questions. They saw a man in a jumpsuit standing among men in lab coats, and they knew who the problem was. They grabbed Elias by the arms, their grip firm and unforgiving. Sterling turned his back on them, dismissing Elias like he was brushing a fly off his shoulder. He told the guards to escort him off the premises immediately. He stripped Elias of his badge, his clearance, and his dignity in a single sentence. He told the head of HR to mark the file as ineligible for rehire. Elias did not fight. He did not scream. He simply nodded, a look of profound sadness washing over his wrinkled face. It wasn't sadness for himself, it was sadness for them. He knew what was coming. The guards marched him to the basement, to the small, windowless closet that served as his office. They watched impatiently as he gathered his life into a cardboard box. It didn't take long. Elias didn't have much. He packed a dented metal lunchbox that had held the same ham sandwich for 10 years. He packed a framed photo of a woman who was no longer there. And finally, he reached to the top shelf and pulled down his most prized possession. It was a book. The Feynman Lectures on Physics. The cover was torn, the spine was broken, and the pages were yellowed and soft from being turned thousands of times. It was held together by the same duct tape he used to fix his shoes. The guards sneered at the book, asking if he had stolen it from the trash. Elias didn't answer. He hugged the book to his chest, the only shield he had left against the world. They walked him to the main entrance. The glass doors of the Hyperion Corporation hissed open, revealing a cold, rainy night. The city lights reflected on the wet pavement, blurring into streaks of neon. Elias stepped out into the rain. The doors slid shut behind him, locking with a mechanical thud. He stood there for a moment, a small gray figure against the towering glass facade of the billion-dollar facility. He was the man who cleaned their toilets, emptied their trash, and knew their secrets. And now, he was gone. Inside the command center, the air was still thick with arrogance. Sterling wiped the board clean, erasing the nonsense Elias had pointed out. He ordered the team to restart the simulation, confident that his genius was unassailable. He pressed the enter key. On the massive main screen, the digital rocket launched. It climbed. It accelerated. And then, exactly where Elias said it would fail, the heat sensors spiked. Behind the glass doors, in the warmth of the lab, a red light began to flash. It pulsed rhythmically, casting a sinister glow over the faces of the confused scientists. The simulation had failed again. But this time, the only man who knew why was walking alone in the rain, catching a bus to nowhere. The bus ride to the south side of the city took 45 minutes. Elias sat in the back, his wet work boots leaving muddy puddles on the floor. He held his box of belongings tight against his chest, staring out at the passing streetlights. To the other passengers, he was just another tired old man returning to a life that didn't matter. He got off at the last stop and walked 3 blocks to a crumbling brick building. He didn't go to the front entrance. He walked around to the alley and descended a short flight of concrete stairs to the basement door. He unlocked it with a rusty key and stepped inside. The air in the apartment was heavy with the smell of old paper and damp earth. It was a tiny, windowless box, barely large enough for a cot and a small table. There was no television. There was no radio. There were no pictures of family or friends on the mantel. But if Professor Sterling had stepped into this room, he would have fallen to his knees. The walls were not painted. They were covered, floor to ceiling, in paper. Every inch of plaster was hidden beneath layers of taped-up napkins, backs of envelopes, and flattened cardboard boxes. And on every single scrap of paper were equations, complex calculus, quantum mechanics, orbital trajectory algorithms that would have baffled the engineers at JPL. This was not the home of a janitor. This was a cathedral of the mind. Elias set his box down on the wobbly table and took off his wet jacket. He shivered, the cold seeping into his bones. He should have been angry. He should have been cursing the men who had thrown him out like garbage. But his mind was not on his hunger or his unemployment. It was on the rocket. For 10 years, Elias had lived a double life. By day, he pushed a mop, making himself invisible, keeping his head down as the brilliant scientists walked past him without seeing him. But by night, he was their shadow. He walked over to a stack of papers in the corner. These were not his own writings. They were crumpled, coffee-stained drafts he had fished out of the recycling bins at Hyperion. They were the discarded failures of the PhDs upstairs. He picked up one sheet. It was a draft of a propulsion theory Sterling had thrown away 3 months ago, marked as impossible. In the margins, in Elias's neat, cramped handwriting, the word impossible was crossed out. Below it, Elias had written the solution. He had fixed their work. He had corrected their logic. And then, he had filed it away in his basement, unseen by anyone but the spiders in the corner. He didn't do it for money. He didn't do it for recognition. He did it because the math spoke to him. To Elias, numbers were not cold tools. They were a language. They were the sheet music of the universe, and he was the only one who could hear the melody clearly. But tonight was different. Tonight, it wasn't just a theoretical problem. Elias sat down at his small wooden table. He opened his lunchbox. He took out the sandwich he hadn't eaten, a simple ham and cheese wrapped in brown wax paper. He unwrapped the food and set it aside. He smoothed out the crinkled, grease-stained wrapper. He closed his eyes. He could see the whiteboard in the command center. He could see the angry red line of the simulation failing. He knew exactly why it was happening. Sterling was calculating the heat dispersion using a linear model, but at Mach 5, the atmosphere behaves like a plasma, not a gas. If they launched that rocket tomorrow, the heat shield would crack 40 seconds after liftoff. The fuel tanks would rupture. The astronauts inside would be vaporized. Elias grabbed a stub of a pencil from his pocket. He began to write. He didn't hesitate. His hand moved across the wax paper with a frantic, fluid grace. He wrote down the Navier-Stokes equations, but he modified them. He added the variable for plasma density. He integrated the chaos theory that Sterling had mocked him for. The graphite snapped. He didn't stop. He sharpened it with a pocket knife and kept writing. The equation grew, spiraling out from the center of the wrapper, a beautiful, complex chain of logic that bridged the gap between failure and flight. 20 minutes later, he stopped. He looked down at the grease-stained paper. There it was, the answer, the missing key to a billion-dollar lock. Elias sat back, rubbing his tired eyes. He had the solution. But he was a fired janitor sitting in a basement on the other side of town. He had no phone number for the lab. He had no badge to get back in. And even if he did, they would arrest him on sight. He looked at the paper, and then he looked at the clock. The launch was in less than 20 hours. He had the power to save them, but he was trapped in a prison of his own social standing. Elias sighed, a sound of heavy resignation. He folded the wax paper carefully and put it in his pocket. He didn't know how, but he knew he had to try. He couldn't let them burn, not when the math was so perfect. Back inside the glass walls of the Hyperion Command Center, the atmosphere had shifted from arrogance to desperate terror. The digital countdown clock on the main wall was no longer just a timepiece. It was a guillotine blade, slowly descending. T-minus 4 hours. Professor Sterling stood before the main console, his hands gripping the edge of the desk so hard that his knuckles were white. His pristine lab coat was now wrinkled, and his tie was loosened at the collar. Behind him, the phone on his desk was ringing relentlessly. It was the senator. It was the board of directors. It was the Pentagon. Sterling didn't answer. He couldn't. On the giant monitor above them, the words, "Simulation 104, catastrophic failure," burned in bright, unforgiving red letters. For the 100th time in a row, the digital rocket had exploded. Sterling stared at the data streams scrolling past his eyes. He was a man who had built his career on certainty. He had written the textbooks these other scientists studied. But now, staring at the thermodynamics readouts, he felt a cold pit opening in his stomach. The numbers didn't make sense. The heat shield was supposed to hold. The alloy was the strongest material on Earth. The math said it was perfect, but the simulation said it was dust. He ran his hands through his thinning hair. He knew there was an error. Somewhere in the millions of lines of code, somewhere in the forest of variables, there was a mistake, a blind spot. For a fleeting second, his mind flashed back to the image of the old janitor pointing at the board. Variable X on line 3. Sterling shook his head violently, banishing the thought. It was absurd. It was insulting. A man who scrubbed toilets could not possibly see something that 20 PhDs had missed. It was a coincidence. It had to be. Sterling returned to his calculations, looking for a complex error, a deep-level coding bug, refusing to accept that the answer might be simple. The room was filled with the murmur of exhausted scientists, typing furiously, looking for a miracle that wasn't coming. In the back of the room, near the heavy security doors, a young intern named David was doing a job he wasn't hired for. With the janitorial staff gone, the trash bins were overflowing with coffee cups and crumpled papers. David had been ordered to clear the mess. He dragged a heavy bag toward the exit, his eyes stinging from lack of sleep. As he bent down to pick up a stray napkin near the doorframe, he stopped. There was something wedged underneath the rubber seal of the security door. It was a small, folded piece of yellow-lined paper. It looked out of place in the sterile, high-tech laboratory, a relic from a different world. It must have been slipped under the door from the hallway, just millimeters of clearance, pushed through with desperate intent. David reached down and pulled it free. He unfolded it. He expected it to be a piece of trash, or maybe a note from a delivery driver. But it wasn't. David was a doctoral candidate at MIT. He knew math. He looked at the scribbles on the paper. The handwriting was shaky, written with a dull pencil, but the logic was piercing. It was a set of thermal equations, but they were different. They accounted for variables David had never seen used in propulsion before. He read the first line. He frowned. He read the second line. His eyes went wide. He looked up at the main screen where the red failure message was still pulsing. Another long time, the first line, the equation on the paper addressed the exact point of failure. It was a bridge over the chasm they had been falling into for 10 hours. David's heart began to hammer against his ribs. He looked at Professor Sterling, who was currently screaming at a lead engineer. David was just an intern. He was nobody. To speak up now was career suicide. But he looked at the countdown clock. 3 hours and 50 minutes. David swallowed his fear. He walked across the room, the yellow paper trembling in his hand. He navigated through the sea of stressed scientists until he was standing right behind the great Professor Sterling. Sterling was in the middle of a tirade. He didn't notice the boy. David cleared his throat. Sterling spun around, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He looked ready to fire the next person who spoke to him. But David didn't back down. He held up the dirty, folded piece of yellow paper. "Professor," David said, his voice cracking slightly before finding its strength. "You have to see this." Sterling looked at the paper with disgust. "I don't have time for your notes, David." "It's not my notes, sir," David said hurriedly, shoving the paper into Sterling's hand. "Someone slid this under the door. Look at the third derivative. Just look at it." Sterling looked down, ready to tear the paper in half, but then his eyes locked onto the numbers, and for the second time that day, the room went silent. Professor Sterling held the piece of paper by the very corner, as if it were contaminated. It was crinkled, stained with oil, and smelled faintly of cheap ham. It was trash. It belonged in a bin, not in the hands of the director of a billion-dollar aerospace project. His first instinct was to crush it. His hand actually started to close, the paper crumpling slightly under his fingers. He was ready to throw it back in David's face and fire him for wasting precious time. But then, the light from the overhead monitors caught the graphite scribbles. Sterling's eyes narrowed. He stopped breathing. There, in the center of a grease stain, was an equation. It wasn't just a correction. It was a complete rewriting of the thermal conduction model. It used an inverse Fourier transform, but applied in a way Sterling had never seen before. It treated the heat variance not as a constant, but as a wave function. It was elegant. It was precise. It was absolutely beautiful. Sterling lowered the paper, his hands trembling. The arrogance that had armored him all day began to crack. He looked at the equation again, tracing the logic steps in his mind. It solved the pressure paradox. It solved the cooling lag. It solved everything. He looked up at the intern, his voice barely a whisper. "Who wrote this?" Sterling demanded, his eyes wide with a frantic intensity. "Which one of my competitors was here? Is this from a professor at MIT? Did someone from Caltech drop this off?" He refused to believe that this level of brilliance could come from anywhere but the ivory towers of academia. He needed a name he recognized. He needed a peer. David, the young intern, swallowed hard. He took a step back, terrified of the reaction he was about to provoke. It wasn't a professor, sir," David stammered. "Don't lie to me," Sterling barked, waving the greasy paper in the air. "This is doctoral-level physics. This is genius. Now tell me who gave it to you." "It was Elias," David said, his voice shaking. Sterling froze. The name hung in the air like a lead weight. "Who?" "Elias," David repeated, gaining a little more courage. "The janitor. The old man you threw out 3 hours ago. I saw him slip it under the door right before security took him away." Sterling felt the blood drain from his face. The room seemed to spin. The image of the old man in the blue jumpsuit flashed in his mind. The man holding the mop. The man he had called ignorant. The man he had humiliated in front of the entire team. Sterling looked down at the sandwich wrapper in his hand. The solution to the billion-dollar problem was written on garbage by a man who cleaned their trash cans. The irony hit him like a physical blow. He held the key to the future in his hand, but he had exiled the locksmith. He's gone?" Sterling asked, his voice hollow. "Yes, sir," David replied quietly. "Security escorted him off the property. He took the bus." Sterling looked at the clock. T-minus 3 hours. The solution was right there on the paper, but it was incomplete. The equation trailed off at the bottom of the wrapper. They needed the rest of it. They needed the mind that created it, and that mind was currently unemployed, wandering the dark streets of a city that didn't care if he existed. Professor Sterling did not run. He marched with the frantic energy of a man whose legacy was burning down. He grabbed his car keys and pointed at David, the intern. "Drive," Sterling ordered. "Get the address from HR. We are going to find him." Minutes later, a sleek black luxury sedan tore out of the Hyperion secure parking lot. It sped away from the gleaming glass citadel of science, heading toward a part of the city that didn't appear on the tourist maps. As they drove, the scenery changed. The manicured lawns and high-tech campuses faded away, replaced by rows of boarded-up storefronts and crumbling brick tenements. The streetlights here were broken, casting long, jagged shadows across the road. Sterling sat in the passenger seat, gripping the leather door handle. He looked out the window at the graffiti-covered walls and the overflowing dumpsters. He locked the car doors. He was a man who understood the physics of the stars, but he was terrified of the reality of poverty. The car slowed to a crawl as they reached the address on the file. It was a condemned building. The windows were smashed. There was no way anyone lived there. David stopped the car. "This is the address on his file, sir," Sterling cursed under his breath. He opened the door and stepped out into the humid night air. His expensive Italian loafers scuffed against the cracked pavement. A group of teenagers was sitting on the steps of a nearby porch. Sterling hesitated. In his world, these were people to be avoided. But he had no choice. He walked over, clutching the greasy sandwich wrapper like a shield. "Excuse me," Sterling said, his voice stiff. "I am looking for a man named Elias. He works as a janitor." One of the young men looked up. He looked at Sterling's suit, then at the expensive car. He stood up slowly. Sterling braced himself for a confrontation. "You mean Professor Elias?" the young man asked. Sterling blinked. "Professor? No, I mean the old man who cleans floors." The young man shook his head, a look of pity in his eyes. "We call him Professor. He sits on this stoop every Sunday and helps my little sister with her geometry homework. He helped me pass my GED math section when my own teachers gave up on me." Sterling was stunned. He looked around the desolate street. In this place, where hope was scarce, the man he had called ignorant was a pillar of the community. Elias wasn't just a janitor here, he was a lighthouse. "Where is he?" Sterling asked, his voice softer now. "He works the graveyard shift at the diner on 4th Street, the young man said. "He needs the extra money for rent since he lost his day job." Sterling felt a sharp pang of guilt in his chest. He nodded a thank you and got back into the car. They drove to 4th Street. The neon sign of Louie's Diner flickered in the darkness. The letter E burnt out. Sterling pushed open the glass door. The bell above it chimed, a cheerful sound that felt out of place in the dreary atmosphere. The diner was empty, save for a truck driver asleep in a corner booth. The air smelled of stale coffee and frying grease. Sterling walked past the counter. He looked into the kitchen, and there he was. Elias was standing at a deep steel sink, steam rising around him like a fog. He wasn't wearing his blue jumpsuit anymore. He was wearing a stained white apron over his street clothes. His hands, the hands that could rewrite the laws of thermodynamics, were submerged in gray, soapy water, scrubbing the burnt crust off a frying pan. He looked exhausted. His shoulders were slumped, and his head was bowed low. Sterling stood in the doorway watching him. For the first time in his life, he didn't see a subordinate. He saw a tragedy. He saw a mind that belonged in the stars, forced to scrub the filth of the earth just to survive. Elias sensed someone watching him. He turned off the faucet. He turned around slowly, wiping his wet hands on his apron. When he saw Sterling standing there in his tailored suit, Elias didn't look surprised. He didn't look angry. He just looked tired. "I finished the dishes, boss," Elias said softly, mistaking Sterling for the diner owner in the dim light. "I'm starting on the floors next." Sterling stepped into the light. "I'm not here for the floors, Elias." Elias squinted. Recognition dawned on his face. He straightened up, clutching the dirty rag in his hand. "Professor Sterling," Elias said, his voice guarded. "If you're here to get my other badge, I already gave it to the guard." "I don't want the badge," Sterling said, his voice trembling slightly. He pulled the sandwich wrapper from his pocket and held it up. "I want the rest of the equation." The kitchen was quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator. Sterling stood awkwardly on the slippery tile floor, clutching his checkbook like a weapon. He was a man accustomed to solving problems with funding. To him, this was just another transaction, a purchase of intellectual property. "Elias," Sterling began, his voice regaining some of its business-like cadence, "I understand there were misunderstandings earlier today. I am willing to overlook the breach of protocol. I need that equation. Elias didn't turn around. He dipped a plate into the soapy water. You fired me, Professor. You said I was dirtying your board. I was under pressure, Sterling snapped, defensiveness creeping back in. And you must admit, a janitor interrupting a top-level briefing is hardly standard procedure. He pulled a pen from his pocket. Look, I am prepared to offer you a consulting fee, $5,000, right now. Just write down the rest of the thermal coefficient and I will leave you to your work. $5,000. It was more money than Elias made in 3 months. It would pay his rent for a year. It would buy him a new coat. It would put food in his fridge. Elias stopped scrubbing. He slowly lifted his hands from the water and dried them on a rag. He turned around to face the billionaire scientist. His eyes were not angry. They were filled with a quiet, piercing dignity that made Sterling take a step back. Keep your money, sir, Elias said softly. Sterling was stunned. It's not enough? 10,000 then. Name your price, man. Do you have any idea how much that rocket is worth? I know exactly how much it is worth, Elias interrupted, his voice firm. But do you know how much a man's pride is worth? Elias walked forward until he was standing toe-to-toe with Sterling. He was shorter, older, and dressed in rags compared to the professor's silk suit. But in that moment, Elias was the giant. You didn't fire me because I was wrong, Elias said, his voice steady. You didn't even look at the numbers. You fired me because you looked at my skin, and you looked at my uniform, and you decided that I didn't matter. You fired me because you couldn't believe that a man holding a broom could understand the stars. Sterling opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. Mathematics is the language of God, Professor, Elias continued, his gaze intense. It does not care if you are rich or poor. It does not care if you are black or white. It does not care if you wear a lab coat or an apron. The equation is either true or it is false. Mathematics does not discriminate. Only men do that. The silence that followed was heavy. The truth of Elias's words hung in the air, stripping away Sterling's defenses layer by layer. Sterling looked at the checkbook in his hand. Suddenly it felt heavy. It felt useless. He looked at the clock on the wall. 90 minutes to launch. He thought about the astronauts strapped into the capsule. He thought about the failure that was inevitable if he walked out of this door alone. Sterling slowly closed the checkbook and put it back in his pocket. His shoulders slumped. The arrogance that had defined his entire career finally shattered. He looked at Elias, not as a janitor, but as a superior mind. I can't solve it, Sterling whispered. The admission was painful. It was the hardest thing he had ever said. I tried. My team tried. We missed the variable. You were right. The plasma density. I didn't see it. He looked up, tears of desperation forming in his eyes. Please, Elias, I am not asking you to do it for me. I am asking you to do it for the 3 men inside that rocket. If we don't fix the code in the next hour, they are going to die, and I don't know how to save them. It was a complete surrender. The great Professor Sterling was begging the dishwasher for help. Elias looked at the desperate man. He could have walked away. He could have let Sterling fail. It would have been poetic justice. But Elias looked at the sandwich wrapper in Sterling's hand, the math he had written. He thought about the beauty of the physics. He thought about the purity of the solution. Elias untied his dirty apron. He folded it neatly and placed it on the counter. We will need a car that drives very fast, Elias said quietly. And you will need to give me a piece of chalk. Sterling let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Thank you, he whispered. Don't thank me yet, Elias said, walking toward the door. We still have a rocket to launch. The heavy security doors of the Hyperion Command Center slid open with a hiss that cut through the tension like a knife. Every head in the room turned. They expected to see a team of consultants, or perhaps a military general coming to shut them down. Instead, they saw Professor Sterling, looking disheveled and humble, and walking a step ahead of him was Elias. Elias was still wearing his street clothes, a faded flannel shirt and trousers stained with grease from the diner's kitchen. He smelled faintly of dish soap and fried onions. In a room filled with million-dollar servers and scientists in Italian suits, He looked like an error in the code of reality. A murmur of confusion rippled through the room. One security guard stepped forward, recognizing the man he had thrown out hours ago, but Sterling raised a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "Let him work," Sterling commanded, his voice ringing with an authority that had been absent all day. "Give him the floor." The room fell into a stunned silence. Elias didn't look at the faces staring at him. He didn't look at the guards who had bruised his arms or the junior scientists who had mocked him. He only had eyes for one thing: the massive glass whiteboard that dominated the front wall. He walked up to it. He picked up a black marker. It looked small in his calloused working man's hand. He didn't hesitate. He didn't check a reference book. He didn't ask for a calculator. Elias began to write. At first, the sound of the marker squeaking against the glass was the only noise in the room. But soon, a rhythm emerged. It was fast, fluid, and confident. Elias wasn't just writing numbers. He was conducting a symphony. He slashed a line through Sterling's previous calculations. He didn't erase them. He corrected them. He dismantled the entire thermal protection model and rebuilt it from the ground up. "You are treating the heat as an enemy," Elias spoke, his voice calm and clear, projecting to the back of the room without a microphone. "You are trying to build a wall to stop it. But at Mach 25, you cannot stop energy. You must guide it." He drew a complex curve that swept across the board. "The plasma is like water," Elias explained, his hand moving faster now, the equations flowing out of him like a river dammed up for 40 years. "If you block the river, it breaks the dam. But if you channel the river, it flows around you." The scientists in the room began to stand up. They moved closer, their mouths hanging open. They weren't looking at a janitor anymore. They were witnessing a master at work. David, the intern, watched with tears in his eyes. He saw the senior engineers pulling out their tablets, frantically trying to check Elias's math, only to realize that he was 5 steps ahead of their processors. Elias filled the first board. He moved to the second, then the third. He was sweating now, his flannel shirt clinging to his back, but his mind was burning with a cold, brilliant fire. He was rewriting the laws of aerodynamics in real time. Finally, he stopped. He capped the marker with a sharp click. He stepped back, revealing a wall of dense, beautiful logic that shimmered under the halogen lights. "The variable x," Elias said, pointing to the end of the equation, "it is not a constant. It is a fluid dynamic. Adjust the code to match this." Sterling looked at the board. He looked at his lead programmer. "Do it," Sterling whispered. "Input the new parameters." The programmer's fingers flew across the keyboard. The room held its breath. The silence was absolute. It was the kind of silence that happens before a miracle or a disaster. "Uploading patch," the programmer said, his voice shaking. "Restarting simulation." On the giant central screen, the digital rocket appeared again. The countdown began. 10, 9, 8. Elias stood alone in the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't look at the screen. He was looking at the floor, listening. Launch. The rocket on the screen roared to life. The telemetry data scrolled by in a blur. Phase 1, green. Phase 2, green. The rocket hit the critical altitude, the point where it had exploded 100 times before. The heat sensors spiked. The red warning light flickered for a microsecond. The entire room flinched. But then, the heat dissipated. The numbers stabilized. The energy flowed around the hull exactly as Elias had predicted. "Heat shield integrity at 100%, the computer voice announced. "Orbit achieved." The screen flashed a massive, bright green text. "Mission success." For a second, nobody moved. Then, the room exploded. Engineers threw their papers in the air. Grown men hugged each other. The applause started as a ripple and turned into a roar, a thunderous ovation that shook the glass walls. Sterling let out a sob of relief, slumping against the console. But Elias didn't cheer. He didn't pump his fist. He simply placed the black marker back on the tray. He wiped a smudge of ink from his thumb. He looked at the board one last time, satisfied that the math was correct. Then, while the rest of the room celebrated the salvation of their careers and the billion-dollar rocket, The old man in the dirty clothes turned around and quietly started to walk toward the exit, ready to go back to the diner to finish mopping the floor. Elias's hand was on the door handle, ready to push it open and disappear back into the night. But he didn't get the chance. "Wait!" The shout cut through the celebration. Professor Sterling ran across the room, pushing past his cheering colleagues. He reached the door just as Elias was opening it. He grabbed the doorframe, breathing hard, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and confusion. "You can't just leave," Sterling said, his voice raw. "You just saved the entire program. You just did math that I have only seen in theory." Sterling looked at the old man, really looked at him for the first time. "Who are you?" Sterling asked, searching Elias's face. "A mind like yours. It doesn't just appear out of nowhere. Where did you study? MIT? Oxford?" Elias smiled, but it was a sad, weary smile. He let go of the door handle and turned to face the professor. "I didn't go to Oxford, Professor," Elias said softly. "I went to Alabama State, 40 years ago." The room quieted down. The engineers and scientists drifted closer, drawn in by the gravity of the moment. "I was a prodigy," Elias continued, his voice steady. "When I was 18, I was offered a full scholarship to the state university. I was going to be an engineer. I had the acceptance letter framed on my wall." Elias looked down at his rough, scarred hands. "But when I arrived on campus for the first day of orientation, the dean called me into his office. He looked at me, and then he looked at my file. He said there had been a mistake. He said the scholarship was for qualified candidates, and that someone like me wouldn't fit in." A heavy silence settled over the room. Sterling felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "They revoked my scholarship," Elias said. "They told me I wasn't allowed in the lecture halls. They told me I wasn't allowed in the library because it was for students only." Elias looked up, his eyes shining with the memory of that old pain. "But I didn't want to be an engineer for the title. I wanted to know how the universe worked. I was hungry for it. So I found a loophole." He pointed to the mop bucket sitting in the corner of the command center. "They wouldn't let a black boy into the library to study," Elias said. "But they needed someone to clean the floors. They needed someone to empty the trash and wash the chalkboards. So I took the job. I became a janitor." The scientists in the room exchanged ashamed glances. "For 40 years I cleaned," Elias said. "And every night, when the professors went home to their warm beds, I stayed. I read every book in the library. I read Newton, Einstein, and Bohr. I cleaned the chalkboards, but before I erased them, I memorized the equations. I learned from the trash you threw away." He took a step closer to Sterling. "I didn't choose the mop because I had no ambition, Professor. I chose the mop because it was the only key they would give me to open the door of knowledge. The world tried to bury me, so I decided to read my way out of the dark." Sterling stood frozen. Tears began to well up in his eyes, spilling over onto his cheeks. He wasn't crying for the rocket anymore. He was weeping for the tragedy standing in front of him. He realized with a sickening clarity that he had almost become the villain of this story. Earlier that day, he had thrown Elias out. He had called him ignorant. He had judged him by his uniform, just like that dean had done 40 years ago. I almost did it again," Sterling whispered, his voice cracking. "I almost threw away the answer because I didn't like the messenger." Sterling reached out and took Elias's hand. It was rough and calloused, contrasting sharply with Sterling's soft, manicured skin. "I am so sorry," Sterling sobbed. "Not just for today, but for every day you had to hide who you were." Elias squeezed the professor's hand gently. "It is all right, Professor," Elias said. "The math is solved. The rocket will fly. That is all that matters." "No," Sterling said, shaking his head fiercely. "That is not all that matters. Not anymore." The next morning, the sky over the launch pad was a piercing, cloudless blue. The countdown hit 0. The ground shook with the force of 1,000,000 pounds of thrust. The billion-dollar rocket climbed into the heavens, riding a pillar of fire. Inside the command center, the thermal sensors held steady. The plasma flowed around the hull exactly as the equations predicted. It was a perfect launch. Later that afternoon, the press conference was packed. Cameras from every major news network flashed, blindingly bright. Professor Sterling stood at the podium, a row of microphones in front of him. The world wanted to hear from the genius who had saved the mission. They wanted to pin a medal on his chest. Sterling looked out at the sea of reporters. He adjusted the microphone. "You are all here to celebrate a breakthrough in physics," Sterling said, his voice echoing through the hall. "You are here to praise the mind that solved the unsolvable." He paused, looking off to the side of the stage. "But that mind does not belong to me." Sterling stepped away from the podium. He walked to the edge of the curtain and extended his hand. "Ladies and gentlemen, please meet the true architect of today's success." Elias stepped out. He wasn't wearing his blue jumpsuit. He was wearing a simple, clean suit that Sterling had bought for him that morning. He walked with a slight limp, but his head was held high. He looked at the cameras, blinking against the lights. Sterling put an arm around Elias's shoulder and pulled him to the center of the stage. "This is Elias," Sterling announced to the stunned world. "He is the reason our astronauts are safe in orbit tonight." The flashbulbs erupted like a storm. For the first time in 40 years, Elias was not invisible. He was the center of the universe. In the weeks that followed, Elias's life changed forever. The Hyperion Corporation, shamed by the revelation of their own prejudice, offered him a formal apology and a position he had deserved decades ago. He was named the honorary senior advisor of the propulsion department. He was given an office with a view of the launch pad, an office with a door that had his name on it in gold letters. But Elias didn't change. When he received his first paycheck, a sum larger than his entire life's savings, he didn't buy a sports car. He didn't move into a mansion. He didn't buy expensive watches. Instead, Elias walked into the office of the city bank and opened a trust fund. He named it the Hidden Figures Scholarship. He dedicated every cent of his salary to paying for the college tuition of underprivileged children from his neighborhood. He funded kids who had been told they weren't smart enough. He funded kids who had been told they didn't belong in the library. He funded the next generation of dreamers who were currently holding mops. Every Sunday, Elias could still be found on the front steps of his old apartment building. But he wasn't just helping with geometry homework anymore. He was handing out acceptance letters. One afternoon, a young boy sat next to him, looking at a complex math problem in a textbook. The boy's shoes were taped up with duct tape, just like Elias's used to be. "I can't do it, Mr. Elias," the boy said, defeated. "My teacher said this math is too hard for someone like me." Elias smiled. He put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Math is never too hard, son," Elias said softly. "The world is hard. People are hard. But the numbers? The numbers are your friends. They are the ladder. And if you climb them, nobody can ever look down on you again." We walk past people every day without seeing them. We judge them by their uniforms, their titles, and the dirt on their hands. We assume that wisdom only lives in ivory towers and expensive suits. But sometimes the people the world forgets are the ones who hold the keys to saving it. So the next time you see someone cleaning a floor or serving a meal or driving a bus, look closer. Do not just look at the clothes they wear. Look at the light in their eyes. Because you never know when you might be standing in the presence of a giant who is just waiting for a chance to touch the stars.